Hello, welcome to the last of these presentations for the syntax seminar, the 13th. And today we're going to be looking at one of my actual favourite areas in syntax, and that's the English gerund. This turns out to be a very odd kind of construction, a bit like a mythical creature in Greek mythology, which seems to be half of one thing and half of another, a bit like a minotaur or a mermaid or something like that. This poses quite a few problems for the kind of theory that we've been building, X-bar theory, the theory of phrase structure, because according to that theory, such mythical beasts shouldn't exist. Let's have a look first of all at what we're talking about when we're talking about the gerund. These are different instances of a gerund here. You can either have something very simple like the building, or the building of a bridge. You can have a possessor with these such things like Clark's building of a bridge. Then you can get other things, which is where the mixture of properties start happening. The second three examples here seem to have more verbal properties rather than nominal properties. So you have Clark's building a bridge, Clark building a bridge, or just building a bridge. Now, it's first of all important that we see what these things are as being one and the same kind of thing. They are all gerunds and not anything else. It's best to see that in context. So if we put them into, say, the subject position of a clause, you can see them for what they are. Okay, so they all go into this position. The building was a good idea. Clark's building a bridge was a good idea, etc., etc. The gerund is what they all have in common, and that is the form of the verb. So we've got a verb there plus this ing. Okay, and that's what makes this a gerund. And it's important to distinguish this from other ing forms. So, for example, we've seen the progressive form of the verb is also verb plus ing. Now, that is a very different kind of construction to the gerund that we're considering here. The gerund is essentially a nominal element, and the progressive is a verbal element. You can see here that with the progressive, building a bridge, it doesn't distribute in exactly the same way as the gerund does, in as much as you can't have the set of things that you can get with the gerund. So where you can have building a bridge, you can't have he is the building, or he is the building of a bridge, or he is Clark's building of a bridge, etc., etc. The progressive distributes basically, as you would expect, like a verb phrase. We've already looked at the progressive as part of the VP and the extension of the VP, adding these aspectual morphemes like the perfect and the passive. And that's how this thing distributes. Okay, and that's clearly a verbal thing. Whereas, as I said, the gerund is distinctly a nominal thing. Okay, so they are different, and we should separate them and not get them confused. Okay, to see why gerunds are nominal, we first of all have to look a bit more carefully at what the properties of nouns are. And we can use these properties to distinguish between the different properties of the various gerunds that we've looked at. Okay, so the first property that we can point to is the fact that nouns are modified by adjectives as opposed to adverbs. Adverbs are what we use to modify verbs and sentences, but nouns are modified by adjectives. So you can have a good idea, but you can't have a well idea. Another thing about nouns that differentiates them from verbs is that nouns don't have objects. This relates to the thing that we were looking at last week to do with the licensing of overt DPs. Verbs can license a DP in their object position, hence they can have objects. Nouns can't. And you can see this best if we take a noun-verb pair which are related to each other, where the verb is a transitive one and therefore has an object, like study, for example. You can study linguistics. But the noun form, students, can't have an object like the verb does, so you can't have students linguistics. Instead, what we have to have with the noun is this preposition of that appears in front of the object. And again, that's to do with this licensing idea that prepositions, like verbs, can license objects. Nouns can't, so you need a preposition inserted into this in order to license the object if you want the noun to have or be associated with some kind of nominal complement. Another thing to say about nouns, which may seem fairly obvious, but is an important observation, as we'll see, is that nouns, head noun phrases, and noun phrases appear inside DPs. That's the distribution of a noun phrase. They only appear inside a DP. So a noun can appear accompanied by a determiner. Verbs, on the other hand, clearly can't. And again, we can show this by taking a noun-verb pair, which are related to each other, and you can see you can have the belief, but you can't have the believe. Okay, so you never get a verb or a verb phrase inside a DP, only noun phrases. Nouns can also have possessors, whereas clauses and sentences and the things associated with the VP can't have a possessor. So you can have John's dog, but you can't say John's will leave. Okay, the subject of a clause can never be a possessor. It has to be something like a nominative or an accusative phrase, a DP. The thing about the possessors with the noun phrases is that they are entirely optional. You don't have to have a possessor, so you can say the dog, and there you don't even imply that the dog has an owner. Okay, or you can include that piece of information, say John's dog. John is the one who possesses the dog. That's very different from a subject, as we've seen. With subjects, you have to have a subject there. You can't choose not to, and even if you don't have a pronounced subject, as you can get with infinitival clauses with a pros subject, you still get the impression that there is a subject there. It still means something even if you don't pronounce it. Whereas with the dog, you don't even get the impression that there is a possessor. So possessors can be completely omitted. You don't have to have them at all. The final thing to say about nouns is that, and nouns inside DPs, is that you never get auxiliary verbs with a noun. Okay, so you can have the investigation, which is obviously built on a verbal element to investigate, but you can't have the will investigation, or the have investigation, or the be investigation. You never get these auxiliary verbs inside the DP along with the noun phrase. Obviously, that's exactly what you get inside a clause accompanying the verb phrase. So John will leave, John has left, and John is leaving. So that's a distinct clausal and verbal property, not a nominal one. Okay, with that under our belts, let's go and have a look at these gerunds and see exactly how they behave. We'll start off with the most nominal type of gerund. Okay, we have something like the building. Okay, where you've just got something that looks like a noun, building. Okay. Note, it behaves exactly like you would expect a noun to. It's modified by an adjective, not an adverb, so you get the tall building. It can't take an object, so you can't say the building, the bridge. It can have a possessor, Trump's building, but it doesn't need to have a possessor. You can say the building, and then there's no indication that anybody possesses it. And you can't have an auxiliary verb, so you can't say the be building. Okay. Now, when looked at like this looks like any other kind of nominalization. That is a verb that we add some morpheme to and it turns it into a noun. Okay, there are many such things in English. Ation is one of them that you can stick onto a verb like observe, and then you get the observation, and that just behaves like any kind of noun. So you get modified by an adjective, continuous observation. Can't take an object. You can't say observation the criminals. It can, but doesn't have to have a possessor, the police's observation, and it doesn't have an auxiliary verb, the be observation. Okay, so it looks as though the gerund is just another one of these morphemes, another derivational morpheme that attaches to a verb and turns it into a noun. So we could say it's like that. However, the difference between the ing morpheme and these other derivational or nominalizing morphemes like munt, ation, and ul, like you get on try with trial, and observe and observation, and government, the difference between those and the ing is that these kinds of morphemes are very specific to particular verbs. It's a lexical process. So observe, for example, is the verb, a kind of verb which can only be nominalized with the ation morpheme. So you don't get observement or observal. Okay, whereas govern, in contrast, is nominalized with ment, and you get government but not governation or governal. So these are very lexically determined kind of morphological processes. The ing morpheme, the ing nominalizing morpheme, on the other hand, is more general than that. And most verbs you can stick ing onto it to form a nominal form. So observe can be observing as well as observation. Govern can be government and governing. Okay, so there is that distinction between this kind of morpheme and the other kinds of derivational, lexical based morphemes. Right, let's look now more specifically at these gerund forms that go beyond this. So we've got this simple type, the building, where you've got build plus ing forming some sort of noun that goes inside the DP, and said it has all the kind of properties of a noun. The other property like a noun it has is in terms of its reference. The building refers to something which is connected to the verb build, but it doesn't refer to what the verb refers to. Instead, what this refers to is the result that you get from applying the process of build. Okay, the building refers to what the result of something that was built. Okay, now that is a very noun-like kind of reference. Nouns refer to objects in general. Okay, now if we compare that to something else like the building of a bridge, where we've now added this extra thing, note now this has more of a verbal type of reference. That is, instead of referring to the result of the building, it actually refers to the process itself. So the building of a bridge referring to the process of the building, of putting the build into operation. Okay, so we can see slightly more verbal properties start to encroach into this structure as we sort of modify it. Despite this, however, this construction here still behaves exactly as a noun would, in as much as, first of all, it can't take an object. Okay, so the building a bridge doesn't work. You've still got to have that of there. Furthermore, it's modified by an adjective and not an adverb, so the hasty building of a bridge rather than the hastily building of a bridge. It can have a possessor but doesn't need a possessor. Okay, and that possessor must be a possessor and can't be just a normal subject. So you can say Clark's building of a bridge as well as the building of a bridge, but you can't say Clark building of a bridge. Okay, and again, that's very much like a DP. If there's a determiner phrase, there's going to be a possessor. And the reason for that is, as we've argued way back at the beginning of this seminar, that S is in fact a determiner. The S in the possessor is the possessive determiner. Okay, so if there is a determiner there, you've got a DP, so the whole thing does behave like a nominal, and you can't miss that thing out if you have something in that specifier of the DP position. Furthermore, you can't have these auxiliary verbs with it. Again, that's a very nominal property. So although this may have a kind of verbal type reference, this kind of gerund where you've got the of a bridge addition to it, it's still very much syntactically like a DP, like a nominal element. Now, let's move on to look at another kind of gerund, and this one is where things, the more verbal properties start to creep into the gerund. Though, as we'll see, this turns out to be one of these mythical beasts, in as much as it's half one thing and half another. The kind of thing that we're talking about here is the clerks building a bridge. Okay, now note first of all, this is more verbal in as much as there is an object there. And the other kind of gerund that we've just looked at can't do that. You can't say the building a bridge. There you've got to have that of, just like normal nouns have to have an of following them. But in this one that we're looking at here, clerks building a bridge, there's no of there. So what we have there is a form building that has an object. And that's like a verb, not a noun. So we can see here there are more verbal properties to this construction. Now, it also has nominal properties, and one of the nominal properties that we can see is in terms of its distribution. Nouns or nominal phrases, DPs, can distribute similar to verbal or clausal elements in certain places. So you can get both nominal DP and clausal CP or IP things in both subject and object positions. So you can say Clark's building a bridge was novel, you can say John building a bridge was novel, but you can also say that Clark built a bridge was novel. So you can get a subject which can be a clause or a DP and one of these gerunds. You can say I applauded that idea, that's a DP, but you can say I applauded that Clark built a bridge, where you've got an IP or a CP there. And you can say I applauded Clark's building a bridge. So this kind of gerund can go in the places where both clauses and nominal phrases can go. However, there are places where you can get a nominal phrase that you can't get a clause. One of them is after a preposition. Clauses don't go after prepositions. You can't say they wrote about that Clark built a bridge. You can, of course, have a nominal phrase there. They wrote about the bridge. And note, you can also get one of these gerunds there. They wrote about they wrote about Clark's building a bridge. Okay, so that way you can see that this kind of gerund distributes like a DP, not like a clause. Another place that you can get it is in subject position with an inverted auxiliary. Clauses don't like that position. If you invert the auxiliary, you get something that doesn't sound quite right. So, did that Clark built a bridge impress you? Doesn't work. Did John impress you? Obviously that works. But did Clark's building a bridge impress you? Also works. So this thing, again, has the kind of distribution of a DP rather than a clause. Therefore, it looks as though what we've got is something like this. Of course, we've got a possessor there, which means that there's a possessive determiner, and the whole thing is a DP. But then we've got this building a bridge there, and we've seen that that does have certain properties which are more like verbs. First of all, as we've seen, there's an object there, not the inserted preposition of, so that's more verbal. Furthermore, this thing is modified by an adverb, not by an adjective. So Clark's quickly building a bridge, but not Clark's quick building a bridge. Okay, so the fact that the gerundive element building there behaves like a verb, in as much as it can take an object and is modified by an adverb rather than an adjective, would argue that the complement of the determiner in this case is actually a verb phrase. So we've got a DP at the top and a VP at the bottom. Okay, as I said, this is the kind of mythical half of one thing and half of another. But there's a problem there. And the problem is that determiners are functional heads, and we've seen functional heads only ever take a very limited number of types of complements. Inflections always take VP complements. Complementizers always take IP complements, and determiners always take noun phrase complements, except for this structure. So here we've got the problem to explain how come the determiner can take a VP complement here, which is very unlike any other kind of functional head that cannot take a range of different types of complements. Now let's go on to look at an even more verbal or clausal kind of gerund, and we'll see that that also introduces problems for analysis. This kind, Clark building a bridge, has very few nominal properties because here we don't even have the possessor, so there's no possessive determiner there, and if there's no determiner, presumably there's no DP. Okay, all we have here is something that looks like a subject. So Clark building a bridge looks like, to all intents and purposes, some kind of a clause. Okay, we've got a verbal element, building, in there, and that verbal element obviously is a verb because it has an object. You don't have the of there. Furthermore, that element is modified again by an adverb, not an adjective, so Clark quickly building the bridge, and moreover it can have an auxiliary verb there. Note the auxiliary verb is the thing that has the ing morpheme on it, and the main verb doesn't, so we get Clark having built a bridge. Okay. Note you can't have a modal in this case, so you might think this indicates that this is less clause-like then, because you can get modals in clauses, and you can't say Clark maying build a bridge. But all this does is it points out that the ing morpheme is in complementary distribution with modal auxiliary verbs, just like tense morpheme is in complementary distribution with auxiliary verbs like modals. And what that would argue instead then is not that this isn't an IP, but in fact that it is an IP, and in fact the ing in this case would seem to be just another inflection. Okay, just like a tense inflection and a modal and the infinitival too, ing is an inflectional element appearing in the I position. Okay, one might argue then that what we're looking at here is another kind of non-finite clause, only instead of having the to in the inflection position, we've got an ing morpheme there. Okay, so Clark building a bridge is just simply an IP headed by an inflection ing. Obviously what's going to happen there is that the build, the verb, is going to move up to support the inflection just as it does with a tense morpheme. Okay. However, there is a problem, and that is, as we've already seen, that this kind of gerund, just like all the other gerunds, distributes like a DP, not like an IP. We've seen there are places where you can't get IPs, clausal elements, i.e. following prepositions and in subject positions with inverted auxiliaries. But this kind of gerund fits in exactly those positions, so it is actually distributing like a DP. You can say, they wrote about Clark building a bridge, or did Clark building a bridge impress you? Okay, that's the kind of place where you can get a DP but not a clause, and that would therefore argue that this whole thing is a DP. And of course that goes right against everything that we've said up until now about X-bar theory, because if ing is an inflection, just like to and just like ud and just like may, which it's in complementary distribution with, inflections project inflectional phrases. X-bar theory says phrases have their categories directly projected from their heads, and an inflection cannot project a DP. A determiner has to project a DP. So we end up then with a kind of a complete and utter monster here, not just a mythical beast, but something completely with the wrong head. Okay. All right. So there are clearly a number of problems with analysing gerunds. We've got the kind of gerunds which are just purely nominal. They're not much of a problem. We can just analyse those as DPs without any problems at all. But then we've got the ones that start to be half one thing and half the other. Those with VPs inside a DP, which shouldn't be. And then we've got the even stranger ones, which seem to be clausal all the way through, except for the very top, where they start behaving like DPs. Okay, now that would seem then that we've got big problems for our theory of phrase structure. There doesn't seem to be any way of bringing these things in to line. However, there is a way of doing this that actually does make sense when we get round to the end of it. It involves assuming something which is slightly odd, but not too disturbing. The odd assumption is that this ing element is actually a noun. Okay. Now, we can justify that on the idea that this ing, as we've seen, seems to be a nominalizing element. But unlike the nominalizing elements like ment or ation or ol, this is a more syntactic type of nominalizing element. As we've seen, it's more productive than the lexical determined type of derivational morphemes. You can stick ing onto virtually any verb to get a gerund form. Given that it's syntactic then, it's not something that happens in the lexicon, but it's something that happens in the syntax. And one way we could see a kind of category changing syntactic thing would be to give the morpheme the category that it changes into and say that morpheme has a special property of taking whatever it turns into a noun as its complement. So another special fact about ing as a noun is that it's a noun that can take a VP complement, unlike any other noun. Okay, now that is going to give us the properties that we need it to have. It's going to give us nominal properties because itself is nominal, and it's going to be able to turn the verb that is obviously going to have to move to support it, just like any other inflectional morpheme does, turns that verb into a noun. Okay, so this is the kind of syntactic category changing process, unlike the lexical category changing process that we get with derivational morphemes. Okay, obviously what's going to happen there is that build, the verb, is going to move to support the ing, and in doing so it becomes a noun. Okay, now there we've got then a noun, and we've got a VP with here just the theme. The other thing we can assume is going on here is that this ing can take any kind of VP as its complement, not just a full VP. Now we've seen verb phrases are quite complicated structures. Some of them are 2 tiers big. You get a small VP at the bottom and then a bigger VP on top if you've got an agent. So verbs that have 2 arguments have got 2 levels to them. Now, it may be then that this ing noun can take any kind of verb phrase as a complement, including that smaller verb phrase where you've just got the theme, okay, which is what we've got here. Build is actually a transitive verb. It involves an agent, but here we've just got that lower part of the verb phrase. So we've got the theme there. But that theme is now introduced by a noun, not a verb, because we've moved the verb into that noun position and made it a noun. And as we know, nouns themselves can't license objects. So therefore, what's going to happen here, because we've got a noun licensing this thing rather than the verb, is we're going to have to insert this of to license that element, just like any other noun. Then we can add that noun phrase formed by that construction into a DP sitting into the complement position of the determiner, just like any other noun phrase can do. And then if we can get a determiner there, obviously we can fill that determiner position with any determiner. Okay, so you can get the building of a bridge. But you can also, just like you can with any other noun phrase, add a possessor. Okay, you don't have to have the possessor, but you can. And when you do, you've got to have the possessive determiner, so you can have Clark's building of a bridge. Okay, so that works out fairly straightforwardly, and that conforms to all the principles that we've seen, and we predict the properties of this kind of gerund. The kind of gerund which involves just the lowest part of the verb phrase ends up with more more nominal properties rather than verbal properties. Now, suppose we give the ing a bit more extensive verb phrase as a complement. This time we've included both levels of this verb phrase, the agentive part, which introduces the agent with the abstract agentive verb, and the thematic part, just involving the theme and the verb. So we've got a complete verb phrase now there. Now, a number of consequences follow from this. First of all, the agent is there. Okay, so it's not an option now that to have the agent. That agent, for whatever reason, again, it seems to be a general property of agents, they have to move out of their VP position and can't be licensed in that position, have to move out of that and up into a higher position where they're licensed. Okay, and obviously, if this whole thing is in a DP, the place to move this thing to is that possessor position. If you've got a possessor in that position, then you have to have the possessive determiner. So there you're going to have Clark's, the possessive element, even though clearly that thing is interpreted as the agent. In Clark's building a bridge, Clark there is not interpreted as the one who possesses building a bridge, but is the agent who actually is involved in building the bridge. Okay, now going further down and looking at the verb phrase, we've got now this complex VP, and as we know, that abstract verbal element is a bound morpheme and has to be supported, so the verb moves up to support that. But note, that thing is a verb. Okay, so when the verb moves into that position, it's still a verb. It hasn't changed its categories. And verbs, as we know, can license objects. So that object there doesn't need to have an of inserted. It can stay as an object. Obviously, the verb is going to need to move further to support that ing. So we're going to get building in the end. And you're going to get Clark's building a bridge. Okay, but that element there is verbal for more of the structure, and therefore we're going to get more verbal properties being added to it. Okay, and the main one being here that the object doesn't need an of there. Again, this still completely conforms to the kinds of X-bar theory predictions that we make. Determiners have NP complements, not clausal complements, etc., etc. So this still works within the theory, and it accounts for all sorts of properties of the different gerunds. As we see then, what the different properties fall out from is how much of a verbal complement the ing nominal element takes. If it takes a small verbal complement, then we're going to get more nominal properties. If it takes a bigger verbal complement, then we're going to get more verbal properties. Okay, that's the end of what I want to say. There is clearly more to be said about gerunds, and I haven't really looked at those gerunds which are even more clausal, but that would take us beyond the scope of what I wanted to discuss here. So we'll just leave those for advanced studies if anybody wanted to go on to that. But for now, that's as much as we need to look at. So we've seen the gerund is an interesting structure, mainly because it poses a number of problems for basic X-bar theory. And it's always good to have things which challenge our conceptions, because it's that way that we actually make progress and can actually develop theories by trying to overcome such problems. We can overcome these particular problems, or many of those problems, if we assume that ing is a noun which has this property of taking a verbal complement, and furthermore that verbal complement can be any kind of a verb phrase, including the little parts of the verb phrase which normally would appear within a larger VP, but in this context they can appear all by themselves without an agent. In that case, you're going to get more nominal properties for the whole construction, or that VP can be a more fuller VP, including both levels with the agentive element added to it, in which case you're going to get more verbal properties. Now note, these conclusions themselves actually give support to that very analysis of the VP that we've been working with up until now. Because unless we did propose that the verb phrase was as complex as it is, and that it can have these two different levels, we wouldn't be able to explain why we get these different types of gerund. If there was just one type of verb phrase, okay, then you couldn't tell the story that we've told now and get the results that there are different levels of verbalness in a gerund. There would just be one type of verbalness, and we wouldn't be able to explain the variety that we actually do find. So this analysis then sort of like reflects back onto previous analyses that we've made and supports them. Okay, that's the end of the presentation, and I will see you in class. Bye bye.